If you ask any scientist, are you sure that human activity is causing global warming? Any scientist should say no, because you cannot be sure. Let's say hypothetically CO2 was good for the environment, and let's say hypothetically the United States possessed all the oil in the world. Well, you'd still have to get off oil because it's a finite resource, and as you start to run out of it, the scarcity would drive the cost up and cause economic collapse. I just don't understand why we'd run that experiment. Particularly when you consider that at some point we have to get to something that is sustainable. We have to have sustainable production of energy and consumption of energy. Because tautologically, if it's unsustainable, you will run out of it.
Now, you might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet, France pays half as much, almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year.
Douglas, it's going to be a long, dark and cold winter for Europe. There is an energy crisis that is almost all self-inflicted.
You don't want your entire economy so unresilient that you're dependent on a single source for your fundamental resource. And everyone who had any sense whatsoever could see that just as clearly as they could see the daylight sun.
As you've noted, there's a reality check underway for all the democracies that have embraced green policies, none more so than Germany.
Had Germany spent $580 billion on nuclear instead of renewables, it would already be getting 100% of its electricity from clean energy sources and all of its transportation energy.
That's right. Just think back over recent years in the West. Who has been perhaps one of the most important voices pushing us all to go straight onto green energy? But of course, a Swedish schoolgirl who decided to play truant.
They invite cherry-picked young people to meetings like this to pretend that they are listening to us.
And we can tell in the fact that we actually had almost every major politician in the West actually listen to her.
How dare you?
We can see a problem, the paucity of the debate in our societies, the lack of seriousness about issues that should be really serious.
About 1 billion people are likely to be starving.
It was completely obvious that unidimensional dependence on the Russians for vital energy sources was a bad strategic idea.
You know, 4 years ago at the UN, Donald Trump said that Germany was too reliant on Russian gas and that it would be paying a price for this. And the German diplomats, including the German ambassador to the United Nations, all laughed away and giggled away at Donald Trump.
They openly laughed at him. There's a shot of the German delegation just sitting there mocking him. They got such a kick out of what they perceived as his ignorance. He was 100% correct. And of course, we're living it right now.
Now, you may not think that Donald Trump is the world's finest purveyor of truth, but he was telling the truth on this occasion.
But Putin was probably not our best ally.
He was saying something that was absolutely true and giving the Europeans a reality check that was long overdue.
Look, I think that a lot of what passes for leftist liberal culture today is essentially economic privilege masquerading as morality.
On the other hand, I think if you're going to converse with people, if you're actually going to have a reasonable conversation with them, I think it has to be about the facts. So basically talking about what can you do? How much good will cutting a ton of CO2 do?
I mean, how are we going to save this planet if people keep asking questions like, will this do any good really? Is this really worth the pain? Are you sure Australia's emissions really could make a difference? Things like that. Stop.
How much good will it do if you recycle a bottle? How much good will it do if you get more fertilizer for poor people? And it turns out, not surprisingly, that most of the things that we focus a lot on are basically feel-good things that'll do very little.
The fact is that in European nation after European nation and in so many other countries in the West, everybody tried to get off fossil fuels too fast. They closed down their nuclear reactors. They didn't want to build any new ones.
Well, those tools would include the famous nuclear plant at San Onofre. But that plant was shuttered a decade ago after 40 years of protests by green activists, supposedly on behalf of something called the environment, something with which they are personally unfamiliar. The effect of shutting down San Onofre? Well, scientists estimate that closing San Onofre led to the release of 37 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, if you believe that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and they all do, that would qualify as a very bad thing. But it didn't stop California from plowing forward anyway and doing more of the same, polluting in the name of saving the environment. Now the state has announced a plan to close the San Luis Obispo Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. That plant supplies energy to millions of other Californians.
In the effort to try to save the climate, are we destroying the environment?
Guess what? It turns out that Vladimir Putin has Europe's winter in his hands.
Remember, every winter, we probably see about 300,000 to 600,000 people die from cold in Europe. We don't have a good sense of proportion if we're only focused on the, and it's actually a lot more, so 100,000, 200,000 people that actually die from heat across the year, but forget the many, many more that die from cold. And that's what we're going to see this winter when we run out of sufficient fossil fuels.
Well, in order to deal with climate change, we're just going to need all the different kinds of clean energy that we have. The problem is that just turns out not to be true. You remember I discussed France a little bit ago. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear.
And some people are going to start freezing. We will be much, much more worried about cold waves than heat waves. But that's not how the media present it. That's why we're in trouble.
Sometimes the level of, I think, personally, you might disagree, that the level of Earth is doomed, there will be no life on this planet will be uninhabitable in 12 years or something. And then that doesn't come to pass. And then a certain amount of people, it sounds very sky is falling.
67% say journalists are purposely is the word, trying to mislead people by saying things they know to be false. So it's not just we don't trust you, it's we believe you're actively making things up.
Germany made this commitment to go all renewables, all wind, all solar. They moved into the 21st century saying, we're going to save the environment. We will save the climate. And they didn't stop to think about exactly what the smartest way of doing that would be, because wind and solar aren't going to do it. They're not ready. And there are all sorts of drawbacks to it. And the other thing about wind and solar is they have to be 100% backed up.
We saw the Netherlands is one of the first countries in recent memory to actually announce, as they did last week, that they're going to start to increase their reliance on nuclear power in recognition that there's just no way they could generate significant amounts of energy enough from solar and wind to meet their climate targets.
And this was totally foreseeable. And the fact that we listened, as I say, to people we should never have listened to.
Blah, 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 blah.
Is something that we will, I'm sure, be reflecting on, and Germans and others will be reflecting on as the lights go out this winter.
Now, I am fascinated by what we are seeing in real time here.
And if you want to see insanity, Douglas.
So California, for example, has now just decided that it's going to ban gas-powered cars. It wants to go all electric. And they're not ready for this, not near ready. He says this is a joke. And so while they may have resolved to do it legislatively, they cannot do it as a practical matter.
The California Energy Commission has just issued a report predicting widespread power outages in the state of California for the next 5 years at least. And of course, September will always be the worst month.
Look at a place like California that has so much of that, so much in terms of environmentalism, and also is the most economically unequal state in the union.
You know what happens at the end of the day when you have a battery powered car? You have to plug it in. You got to plug it into something.
it's become very, very clear that the environmental causes at stake here are in deep tension with the working class. Now, that doesn't mean that environmentalism isn't important. It doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening and isn't something that we have to really do our best to take care of and to mitigate. But the Green New Deal, a lot of the stuff bound up in the environmental lobby is coming at the expense of the working class.
We're looking at what's happening in Europe and Germany, the UK, across the continent, and we're following those policies here in Australia.
Yes.
So we're seeing them
That's right.
in action. We are seeing the suffering, the prices soaring. I think energy prices in the UK have jumped 80% in 12 months.
What is the Granholm plan to increase oil production in America?
Oh my God. That is hilarious. Would that I had the magic wand.
Every time I fill up, it's close to like $80, $90.
How do you feel about that?
It's making me broke.
Oh my God.
I mean, it's hard to make plans when you've got an administration that's trying to crush your future.
Oh my God. That is hilarious.
Businesses are closing. People can't afford their bills, and Australia's going, oh, we'll have some of that.
This is what happens when you only worry about global warming. If global warming is the only thing on your radar, you obviously forget all the other things.
Exactly. I mean, imagine that you run a pub or something, and you've seen your bills go up this much. How long can you keep going for? You know, you're a small business, you've seen your bills go up this much. Just how long can you keep going for?
There's something morally wrong about this of saying, yeah, you know what? You know, a couple 100 million people are going to starve, but at least we didn't use extra gas.
The Green parties in the West, all in recent decades, had this incredibly free reign. They had incredibly radical policies about basically getting off all of our existing energy supplies to leap to an energy supply that didn't yet exist or didn't exist in sufficient enough quantities. They all got away with that. The supplicant media sucked it up.
People don't trust us, they don't believe us, and it makes me wonder if this job, if it's doing more harm than good.
Now, as I say, we see the reality biting, and one of the most interesting ones is the Green Party in Germany. The Green Party in Germany doesn't have the luxury of being in opposition, as so many Green parties do. They're part of the coalition government. They recently had to agree, basically, to the continuation of fossil fuels in Germany.
Germany, you know, let's save the planet, 21st century Germany. Guess what they're going to have to do now? They're going to have to use coal. Coal.
Currently in Germany, there's protesters trying to block a new coal mining project that would involve destroying the ancient Hambach forest in order to get to the coal underneath, all in an effort to phase out nuclear and expand solar and wind.
They're trying to hold out on the nuclear issue and still oppose the reopening of the German nuclear power plants, or at least not closing them, as Angela Merkel wanted to do.
In places that are using a lot of nuclear, have grids that are mostly nuclear and hydro, going towards solar and wind and other renewables would actually increase carbon emissions.
There's nothing wrong with getting your power from other places, because actually, you know, where they can do it most effectively is probably a better idea.
So not only is China absolutely not obeying by these same cleanup standards, but they just created this new train that carries their coal from A to B. They're openly in love with coal.
Maybe now that old friend of conservatives, reality, is going to teach everyone one of her great lessons. You know, we can dream of getting onto renewables, but not until they're there for us to use.
If you are concerned environmentally, and there are some reasons to be concerned environmentally, you would have to point to the fact that the Americans and their success with fracking drove their carbon emissions down 15%, I believe. They're the only industrialized country that has managed this. And so if you were really concerned about the environment, you would note that and you'd think, well, this is a lot better than the alternative, which is high energy prices, which are hard on the poor, hyper-dependence on the Russians as single source energy. Well, and then the fact that if you don't frack, you have to turn to alternate energy sources that are going to pollute or leave you vulnerable.
We have staked so much of our financial and energy futures on a dream which we were sold on extraordinarily false pretenses.
As president, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present danger.
I did not sign up for this. This is somebody's bullshit political agenda.
And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
It's the empowering of China as well. I mean, don't forget, under the Paris Accord, they can keep polluting as much as they want, and they really, it only counts at 2030, when the United States is allegedly going to cut its greenhouse gases by 50%. Australia's going to go 43%. We will be reliant on buying technology from essentially an adversary, we used to call them enemies, but an adversarial country that will only get more powerful and more dirty and more polluting.
Yeah, the same way as much of the rich world is saying to the poor world, you guys, we got rich from using lots of fossil fuels, but you guys, you don't really need that. Which, of course, to a very large extent, means leaving them in poverty.
The banks of this world know it's not going to happen. Otherwise, you couldn't get a goddamn loan in London. You know those 30, 40-year mortgages? The world will be over by then.
They've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us?
There are some problems with fracking in the US, but fundamentally, fracking has made the US both much more energy independent, and it has actually reduced dramatically the emissions of the US. The US has reduced its emissions more than any other country in the world over the last 10 years. Europe did not do that because we had cheap Russian gas. And now we're in this pickle. So fundamentally, it's because we don't like coal, we love renewables, and then we need lots of gas. And there we are right now.
So say what you will about politicians, like them or not, it's indisputable that on the question of energy, they have no idea what they're doing. And we know this because their track record of incompetence is lengthy and unbroken. They are majestic in their ineptitude. So naturally, they want more power over power. There's just so much more to destroy.